And thanks everybody for coming on, and I'm sure you've all been following, particularly in the media over the last number of weeks, and what was taking place around climate change, and around, I suppose, more in particular around where we are now, and I suppose where we came from as well. And before I start, there's a lot of people on the call there that I just want to thank again, for the effort and the work that was put in, both as members of IFA and our National Council in lobbying our TDs and our political system over the last number of weeks. And it definitely had a bearing, a clear bearing on the outcome of where we landed last Thursday evening. And obviously there was a very political decision had to be made between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens. And I suppose, as we know, looking back on this, since this act or this bill came to the Dáil this time last year and was enacted into law, and we have binding laws around this and around the sectoral emission ceilings, and it was agreed at the time that the decision will be given to the government, or to the cabinet, to make the decision going forward on the ceiling that each sector would get. And we had a range of 21.7 to 30%. I think we know now that we landed at a 25% reduction last Thursday, and we had been clearly saying that it was always going to be a challenge to achieve a 22% reduction, and there was a roadmap in place to get us somewhat along that journey. And so now, look, obviously there's an enormous task now to achieve 25%. And look, the idea of this evening was we had a council meeting on Friday, and the view of council was, it would be important to update all our members, or as many members as possible, on where we're at now. And so what we're going to do this evening is we have Carol Cossain, who's standing in this evening for Geraldine O'Sullivan, who is our environmental executive, and Carol is very, very good on this topic as well. Geraldine is on annual leave, so Carol is going to give the update on behalf of Geraldine, and Tig Buckley is on here as well, and Paul O'Brien, the chair of our environmental committee, is also online there this evening. And I suppose it's important that we have a look at the background of this, how we came to where we are at the moment, and I know the lads are going to have a look at internationally how we came here, and obviously nationally here at home as well. So look, I'm not going to delay you. It's a fine evening. We'll get through this as fast as we can. And Carol, you're going to kick it off there, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, President. Yeah, I'll just wait for the slides just to appear so everyone can see them. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just going to give a quick run through the background of the international dimension on climate, setting climate targets, how they are monitored and accounted for, and how that ties back to us here in Ireland. So next slide, please. So first up, there are a few international organisations and agreements that are very important when we speak on climate change, and I'll be mentioning these during my presentation. So they include the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Fit for 55, which led from the EU Green Deal here in Europe, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Next slide, please. So as the President just outlined, I'll just give a very quick history first of how we got to where we are today, like on the kind of movement of the different kind of agreements that have happened in the past on climate change. So if we go back to 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change established an international environmental treaty to combat, in its words, the dangerous human interference with climate systems. And in part, this was to be done by stabilising greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And if we look at it from an agricultural point of view, in Article 2 of that treaty, it actually states that the looking out at the interferences in climate systems should be achieved within a time frame that allows ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change to ensure that food production is not threatened. So Ireland actually reports its emissions to the UN FCC every year. So that's been there since 1992. So leading on then to 1997, there was the Kyoto Protocol out of Japan. So that was a commitment of industrial countries to reduce emissions by 5.2% on 1990 levels by 2012. And under the terms of the EU burden sharing agreement that came on the back of that, Ireland's target was to limit greenhouse gas emissions to 13% above 1990 levels in the period 2008 to 2012. So further on then, one that most people would be very, very aware of and hear it in the media fairly often is the Paris Agreement. So the meeting in Paris actually happened in December 2015, but the agreement itself wasn't signed off until 2016. So it was a legally binding, or is a legally binding international treaty on climate change, and it was adopted by 196 countries. So really, what it kind of means, or what the basis of the Paris Agreement is that limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. So then on the back of the Paris Agreement, the EU has looked about setting in motion its own climate rules and climate policies to actually hit what was agreed within the Paris Agreement. So first up, we had the Green Deal in 2019, and that set out a series of policies to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. And if we lead on to July 2021, European climate law actually came into force, and it set a legally binding target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And also at that stage in July 2021, the EU Commission adopted the Fit for 55 package to ensure these emission reductions of 55% by 2030 will happen. And I'll cover a little bit more about their kind of interactions with agriculture as we go through this evening. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier on, there's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a really, really vital body when we're talking about climate change. So it was actually created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Programme. And it's got an objective to provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. Now, reports are often issued from the IPCC, and they're key to international climate change negotiations. Now, it's an organisation of governments that are members of the UN, and it's there to monitor and assess all the global science related to climate change. So if we look there at the little diagram or the little pictures there on the left-hand side, it kind of sets out the structure of the IPCC. So within the IPCC, there's 3 working groups. Now, the first working group looks at the physical science of climate change. The second one is looking at the impacts and adaptation resulting from climate change, and the third one is looking more around the mitigations. Now, also within it is what's known as the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, and I just want to mention that for a few seconds because I'll be talking about it a little bit more later on. So this is actually where international agreed methodologies for calculating and reporting national greenhouse gas emissions and removals are actually set. So as you can imagine, so all countries are reporting on the same kind of basis. There has to be some kind of rules, and the rules are coming from here. And they're actually coming from a 2006 guidelines. That's when the guidelines were put in place and agreed. Now, refinements can take place from time to time, depending on advances in scientific or in technical discoveries. Now, the only thing I'll say is that the refinements, because I wouldn't call them updates, refinements don't happen that often. So last was in 2019. Before that was 2013. So if there's something that needs to be updated here and it can be proved that it's correct to update it, then it will be refined within the 2006 guidelines. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier on, we had the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2016, and it's looking at keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees and if possible at 1.5. So looking at it from an agricultural point of view, I picked out 3 little parts where it's mentioned within the agreement. So one of the most important ones, I think, from our point of view, is that it states that it should be recognised the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger, and the particular vulnerabilities of food production systems to adverse impacts of climate change. It also mentions that we should try and make sure that the temperatures don't go beyond the 2 degrees and stay substantially below that in a manner that doesn't threaten food production. And also it mentions that parties should take action to conserve and enhance as appropriate carbon sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, including forestry. So these are the parts where agriculture is mentioned within the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So, as I say, that led on then to what was put in place here in Europe with the EU Green Deal and the Fit for 55. So that's looking at reducing emissions by 55% compared to 1990 levels by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. Now, looking more at our own area again, at what's kind of happening in agriculture, we've got the land use change and forestry. So that kind of takes up what's happening with land and in forestry. And in Europe as a whole, there's actually net removals. So there's actually more sequestration than emissions from LULUCF for the shortened version. But as part of what's happened with Fit for 55, they have upped the amount of removals that need to happen by 2030 to 310 million tonnes across the EU. And they've also said that by 2035, we need to combine agriculture and LUCF, and the two together need to be climate neutral by the time we hit 2035. So this all sounds good in theory, but there's a few little negative things that have come out from, say, the reductions in this emission. So the European Commission's Joint Research Centre actually done some research on kind of the effects and what will happen with these reductions. And one of the things that kind of jumped out in the report is that they're forecasting that agricultural production within the EU will drop by 15% by 2030 due to the reductions that are going to happen on the greenhouse gases and the plans of how that's going to happen. And also in the report, taken on board biodiversity, farm to fork, and the new CAP, yes, we're expecting greenhouse gas emissions to actually fall, say, within the EU, but actually 2/3 of the savings that happen within the EU are going to be carbon leaked to countries outside of the EU. So even though we'll have a large reduction within Europe, 2/3 of what we actually save here are actually going to be emitted in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So kind of bring it back here to Ireland and looking at our kind of main agricultural emissions. So the main emissions here in Ireland is methane, it would be our biggest one, followed by nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So methane really is from animals, from the digestion of what they're eating. The nitrous oxide, the main driver, is our fertilizers, and then carbon dioxide, which is much smaller in agriculture, is mainly driven, say, by the green diesel we burn in our machineries and probably the making of lime for spreading on agricultural land. So as you can see, we have different gases here and they have different lifespans. And then there's a thing called the GWP. So what the GWP is, it's the global warming potential, and it's trying to kind of set in play or put in place somewhere you can actually compare, say, countries and sectors on a kind of an equal basis. And the way it's currently measured is on something called the GWP 100, which is carbon dioxide at 1, methane at 28, and nitrous oxide maybe around 270. So it's looking at how much effect it has on warming, because the likes of your methane and your nitrous oxide actually are kind of much more kind of condensed and they cause much more warming than your ton of carbon dioxide. Now, in the last IPCC report, it actually is acknowledged that new emission metric approach, which is known as a GWP star, which has come out of a guy called Miles Allen in Oxford, actually gives a better accounting for the different behaviours of short-lived gases, of which methane is one. And what it's looking at is that if there's no new, say, emissions of methane at the exact same level it has been for the past number of years, the GWP 100 is actually overstating the warming effect by 3 to 4 times. So that's something that needs to be looked at. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about methane, most people on the call will probably have heard of biogenic methane. And what biogenic methane really is, it's kind of what I'll say, it's on the left-hand side there of the little diagram or the little picture I've up there. It's what we call almost like a kind of a natural cycle. It's where grass grows, cow eats the grass as she digests the grass in the room, and some methane is actually expelled. After about maybe 10 to 12 years, that's oxidized in the atmosphere, turns back into CO2, and then through photosynthesis, it's actually broken down into glucose, and that makes your plant fibers and carbohydrates, and then the cow re-eats the grass again. So therefore, it's recycled carbon, and it's not new carbon within the atmosphere once it's the same number of animals you have on the farm. Now, that's in contrast, say, to CO2 from fossil fuels, which is on the right-hand side of the diagram. So that's carbon that's been locked up in, say, the planet for millions of years. We dig it up or we drill it up, whichever way we want to bring it up. We combust it, and anything we emit that way is actually new carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere, and that's going to affect temperatures for a long period. Next slide, please. So again, measuring methane in the inventory, as I say, at the moment, everything is in under GWP 100, but looking at IPCC, and that probably over the next period of years, we will hopefully move towards GWP star. So as I say, with GWP star, if methane emissions are actually stable, there'll be no new warming. And what it's actually shown is that a 3% reduction per decade, which is about 0.3, 0.4 of a reduction per year, would actually result in nothing happening, say, from a warm point of view in the atmosphere. Now, the only thing I'll say with the GWP star is, yeah, it recognises that, say, for constant methane emissions, it's overstated in GWP 100 by about 3 to 4 times. But if you actually add new methane, as in increase your cow number, say, it'll actually have an effect of about 4 to 5 times as much as what's actually measured in GWP 100. So if you've got a stable herd or a herd that's reducing a little bit, then GWP star is actually, because it's measuring it correctly, is showing that there's no extra effect of warming, but any addition of numbers or of methane emissions actually results in a big jump when you look at GWP star. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the calculations of emissions, it's actually done here in Ireland by the EPA, and they say put together the National Emission Inventory. Now, this is a little bit complicated here, so I'll just go through it very quickly. So when you look at agricultural emissions, it's really coming up from two sides, which is fertilizer and livestock are the main driver. So your fertilizer, the main kind of driver there is your type of fertilizer at the moment. So that's why you'll hear a lot of talk about moving towards, say, protected urea and products like that, because there's much less emissions from protected urea as compared to cans. So that'd be favourable in our inventory. Now on the livestock side, you've got your cattle, sheep, pigs, etc. Now it's much more complicated here because it's all about the managing them and what happens to them. So it's how long they're grazing for, what kind of grasses they're grazing, how long they're housed for, what kind of housing they're in, the manure management, how that slurry or dung is stored, how long it's stored for, how it's actually applied in land. So all of these things and the timing of its application, these all feed in to calculate up the national inventory or the amount of, say, emissions we have in agriculture. Next slide, please. So as I say, the EPA put the national inventory together here in Ireland, and they report that to the EU and the United Nations, and it'll be also used in for the likes of, say, setting carbon budgets or even the sectorial targets and that, because they'll do forecasts of where emissions are going. So as I say, when they're calculating the emissions, it's based on the guidelines that were agreed at the IPCC, that 2006 guidelines that I mentioned earlier on. And how you get to emissions is it's activity data by emission factor. So you take your suckler cow or your dairy cow and you multiply it by the emission factor on her, and that gives you the emissions from that cow or that sheep or whatever way you want to look at it. Now, there's different methodologies. It's a little bit complicated, but I just mentioned this because it is important. So there's 3 different methodologies used. There's tier 1, 2, and 3. So tier 1 is what we call the simplest. So this is kind of using just the international kind of averages to calculate up, and that's what's used in countries that they get better data. Now, tier 2 is more country specific. And some people might have noticed there in the last number of weeks, it's been mentioned in some papers and that Teagasc are actually undertaken or have undertaken some research in Moore Park, and they have showed that dairy cows actually grazing grass are emitting 18% less methane than what's actually in the emission factor at the moment, because it's kind of an average of, let's say, more house animals. So that's where tier 2 comes in. It's very important that we have that data on our emissions here in Ireland instead of using, say, international standards, so we actually get a true picture of what emissions are coming from agriculture. Next slide, please. So a bit like the 2006 IPCC guidelines, there is refinements that happen the whole time. So as science and knowledge progresses, like that study that's going on methane, or like any other kind of studies, I think there's ones going on beef animals and different things like that to see what they're actually emitting. So as that actually progresses and it's measured, it's reported, and it's verified, and it's peer reviewed, that will actually feed into how our emissions are calculated in the inventory, and EPA will take in that data. So there is always ongoing, say, engagement with Teagasc, Department of Agriculture, ICBF, and all other stakeholders to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date emission figures that we can have. Now, as I say, you can't just willy-nilly put that in. It has to be peer-reviewed, it has to be proved, and it'll be looked at by the EU and the UN to make sure that what you've in there is correct if you're making any changes. Next slide, please. So just kind of bringing it back here to Ireland and looking at our emissions here. So unfortunately, from our point of view here in agriculture, the EPA report was issued there maybe in the last 2 weeks, and it's pointed out that agriculture's emissions are actually up 3% in 2021 over 2020. Now, the main drivers they have in that is extra fertilizer, a small increase in dairy cows, and an increase as well in milk production, they're saying. So if we look there towards the left at the kind of the long bar graphs that are there, we've got from 1990 to 2020. So as you can see, emissions were raising through the 90s up to the mid-90s, then they kind of fell off. And again, say from about 2013-14 on, we've been raising emissions. Now in 2021, we have emissions of about 23 million tonnes. And that actually is roughly the exact same figures we had in 2018. And we were talking about sectorial targets. It's off 2018 figures. They will be based. So it's based off the same figures what we were actually emitted in 2021. So that's there. Can the next slide, please? So then, sorry, this is now my final slide, and it's just a very kind of quick picture of where agri emissions sit in the whole picture in Ireland, and then what the split is here. So on the left-hand side, as most people are aware, probably about 37% of agriculture, our say national emissions actually come from agriculture in 2021. And if you look back through the years, even back to 1990, that was still about the same percentage back then. Now, a number of other industries such as transport that have had a huge jump since, but agriculture has remained roughly about stable. So as I mentioned earlier on there on the top pie chart on the right hand side, the main driver of emissions in Ireland is actually methane. So that's coming from our animals, from the digestion that's happening. To a lesser extent, it's nitrous oxide from our fertilizers and that, and then a much smaller amount from carbon dioxide, which would be the burning of green diesel and things like that. And then if we just move down finally to the bottom right hand side, to kind of it's showing up the source of where that say amount of 23 million tonnes is actually coming from. So the main driver in there is about 61% is actually coming from enteric fermentation. So that's what happens in the digestive system of ruminant animals such as cattle and sheep, and it's methane that's emitted there. Now, the next biggest is the agricultural soils. Now, what's happening there? It's the actual activity, direct and indirect, and the emissions of nitrous oxide related to agricultural production, application of fertilizer, animal waste, organic fertilizers, cultivation of the soil, and the mineralization of crop residues. And into a lesser extent, again, with manure management, which is really a methane and nitrous oxide, which is produced during the management, storage, and the spreading of the manures. There's three other smaller ones: you fuel combustion, urea, and liming, but they're a small percentage. So that's roughly the picture of what's happening there with the Irish emissions, and as I say, where we got to this stage from, say, the international agreements and international organizations. So that's kind of the end of my section of this presentation. Welcome any questions at the end, and I'll hand you over to Tig now. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. You just might give me the thumbs up, Carl, to say you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you, Tig.
Perfect. Great. So thanks very much, and thanks, Carl. So so Carl has covered, I suppose, what we've tried to do at the start of the presentation is to kind of put context in terms of why we got to where we got to in terms of the Climate Action Plan and the Climate Act being put in place, and also to try and give a better understanding of how emissions are calculated, because I suppose the thing to remember here is that we are operating based within international frameworks which can be changed, but we can't change them overnight, or we don't directly control them. So what we have to do is work within the parameters we are at the moment, but also obviously very much ensure that we can influence where we can at all possible to make changes that make the way we look at emissions and removals from Irish agriculture as fair and as appropriate as possible. And at the moment, some of the ways that we are measured, you would have to say, are probably somewhat balanced against us. And I didn't go into a small bit of that detail as we go on. But more of it then is probably a factor of what we cannot, that we don't have country-specific research completed as of yet. It's underway, and when it is done, it will then obviously strengthen our case more. And I'll speak a small bit more about that. So just maybe Ethan, you might move on to the next slide. So just in terms of where we are, so the Climate Act and the climate targets, it's really a national approach to an international issue. In terms of internationally, while we have a significant agricultural economy in Ireland relative to the size of the country, we still are very, very, we're still tiny in international terms. We account for a very small amount of international emissions. Now, having said that, we have to do our part as well in terms of from a climate change perspective and in terms of reducing emissions. And I don't think that it would be unreasonable to say that most, if not all, farmers recognise that that we do have to do more, and we have to do what we can to try and play our part in reducing emissions in terms of helping address climate change. So really there's probably four aspects here. So what we know, well, first of all, what we know today is that we have a 25% target now set to reduce agri emissions from 2018 levels by 2030. And the emissions that we have in 2021 are more or less the same as what they were in 2018. So we have to reduce in 9 years by about 25%, which is a very daunting task. You know, we would have felt that 22% was very, very challenging, but we could see a potential pathway there with a lot of, I suppose, the wind behind us, so to speak. 25 is a step on again. It's 3 percentage points more, which is, you know, in tons wise, 1.75 million tons extra reduction. And that is going to be significantly more challenging. And I suppose when we talk about then the known unknowns, well, we're not sure at the moment what the plan the government have to set out how we're going to achieve this 25%. So the government gave us their climate action plan last November, which set out a pathway to 18%, and with future technologies, the capacity maybe go a small bit more. We will now need a new plan to show us how they plan for us to get to 25%. What we also don't know is what supports are going to be made available to farmers, because this is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost farmers money, and it's going to cost the industry money. And the question we don't know is what sort of funding package is going to be put behind that, because we haven't, in the announcement last week, there was no mention of any funding whatsoever. And then I suppose that what we clearly don't know either is what impact this is going to have on farm and rural economic sustainability. I mean, we had the KPMG study done by the Irish Farmers Journal and the Agricultural Trust, which did show that potentially this is going to have a massive negative impact on rural economies, both at farm level and in terms of, you know, direct employment from agriculture as well. So they are the real challenges we're facing when we sit here this evening with a 25% emissions reduction target. Next slide, please. So, and I suppose, as Carol has covered, the accounting framework at the moment does put us to a certain extent on the back foot. And we've talked about some of those aspects. For instance, the GWP 100 versus GWP star, that certainly is a challenge when it comes to measure methane, but it does need to be borne in mind that in the context of increasing numbers, having GWP star versus GWP 100 is not necessarily going to be a massive game changer for agriculture. But if methane stabilizes, you know, possibly through a feed additive, which is a real possibility in the coming years, in a stable methane environment, a GWP star position, it is much more accurate in terms of measuring what type of impact methane has in terms of on increasing global temperatures, which is ultimately the objective of the Paris Agreement. I suppose another real bugbear of farmers, and rightly so, is that two things really. So first of all, if you look at how agriculture emissions are calculated, they're calculated at the source of production rather than the source point of consumption. So, for instance, if you take oil, Saudi Arabia is a large exporter of oil. The carbon tax on oil is placed at the point of consumption, and there is no looking at the point of production. Agriculture is the opposite, and that is really, I suppose, something that there's real, you know, justifiable reason to point out that that's not necessarily the right way to do it. Having said that, that's the international framework within which we are working, and certainly I know it's part of the programme for government to try and look at study in terms of a point of consumption analysis, and we've been pushing for that from an IFA perspective, that be completed. And I suppose finally then the whole agriculture versus energy measurement. So you probably heard that the Minister for Environment, Eamon Ryan, pointed out on more than a couple of occasions the last couple of weeks, when it was said, well, what could agriculture do to reduce its emissions? He mentioned anaerobic digestion, and solar. Now, and as well as that, his department in a performance in the Joint Oireachtas Committee, which left a lot to be desired in my view, pointed out these options for farmers as well. When in reality, farmers that put in solar are either put in anaerobic digestion systems or provide feed as feedstock for it, will not get any of the credit from an energy perspective from those models. And now that is the framework that we are working in from the IPCC. So there is a challenge around that we can't necessarily change the rules ourselves. But at the same time, we felt that it would have been very reasonable then for agriculture to get a lower target because of that. The reality is that a farmer could be growing grass to feed an anaerobic digester, could be putting out fertilizer on grassland, and obviously burning diesel in a tractor and harvester, whatever's harvesting it. And the fertilizer and the green diesel that's used to grow grass to go into the anaerobic digester will count to agricultural emissions, but the energy that comes out of the anaerobic digester will be credited towards the energy sector. And that's just the framework we're working in, which is, you know, I think farmers rightly would feel that that's not a level playing field to be operating in. And it's something that we think needs to be addressed from in some format as we look forward in terms of how this the evolving nature of the Climate Act and the sectoral emission ceilings. Next slide, please. So I suppose what we've been trying to do as well in the whole, from an IFA perspective over the last number of weeks and months, is trying to bring balance to the debate. And in fairness, and I think the President mentioned this earlier at his opening address, we do really appreciate all the work that was done across every county in the country in terms of and I don't want to call it lobbying, because I think it was for our members representing their industry and appropriately putting across the reasoned argument as to why we should be getting a lower target for agriculture. I mean, some of the things that we were pointing out, we pointed this out through national media adverts the end of last year and again on social media throughout the year, is that if you look at numbers of cattle over the last 20 years, the number of cattle in Ireland is the same, hasn't increased. In the same period, Irish vehicles numbers have gone up by 75%. The number of passengers through Dublin Airport has increased by 155%. Now, we're not saying that people should not go through Dublin Airport or cars should come off the road. We're just trying to put context to the argument. And unfortunately, some of the people on the other side of the argument were blaming us for potentially taking cars off the road, which, you know, in our view is completely unfair and not a reasoned or balanced way to be arguing this challenge that we're facing. Next slide, please. And I suppose just in that context, I think that some of the representation that our members did, I just took a handful of pictures here showing Galway IFA lobbying. We had the Minister for Environment being tackled by some of our officers, Francie Gorman, our regional chairman, and I see a couple of other members, the President being on prime time as well, and other national media outlets to try and put a balance to what was in terms of the argument that was being put forward in terms of what level of a sector emission ceiling agriculture should get. And we felt that as you know, that to try to and we felt that overall the IFA through our grassroots did a great job in putting that argument forward to our public representatives. Next slide, please. So just to touch on the Climate Act. So the Climate Act, first of all, it was brought into law in July of 2021. And it's also worth bearing in mind that every single political party, with the exception of a handful of TDs, supported and voted for the Climate Act. So it has got cross-party approval, and that set out objectively by 2050 that Ireland should be net zero. But there was a couple of things that, from an agriculture perspective, are in the Act, which is very important to note. The first thing that's in there is that the Act has to avoid the risk of substantial and unreasonable carbon leakage. Now, what carbon leakage is effectively is if you stop the production of we'll say we're talking about food here. So if you curb the production of food in one area, and then it leads to producing it somewhere else with a higher carbon emission, you leak carbon to that place. So we know that dairy and beef are both among the most carbon efficient systems internationally that we have in Ireland in terms of producing milk and dairy and beef. So it's inevitable that if you curb production in Ireland, you will lead to carbon leakage. And Carol mentioned earlier, even at European level, when they looked at the whole farm to fork policies, it showed that well over half of the carbon that would be mitigated in Europe will be leaked, because other countries internationally are not going to follow the same level of climate ambition that the EU has set out. The other aspects that are in there is that there was a recognition of the special economic and social role for agriculture, and it also had to consider the distinct characteristics of biogenic methane. Now, from our perspective, in our interaction with the government, we've been pointing out we want to see how that was done. So can we see, was there an impact assessment done on carbon leakage? How was biogenic methane taken into account in arriving at these figures? And these are questions that probably we haven't got, I would say, full answers to yet, and it's something we will continue to press. So and I suppose the other thing to remember is that there is also recognition that carbon removals will need to be considered as part of carbon budgets. And that is there due to a strong lobbying campaign by the IFA, where we, through the help of senators in the Seanad, we tabled an amendment which was ultimately a form of which was taken on board, which ensured that carbon removals are inside in the Act. Now, that doesn't really have a massive benefit for us as we sit today, which I'll explain a small bit in more detail later. But as we move on through the decade and into the next decade, we believe it's going to become very, very important to have that removals clause in the Act. Next slide, please. So we move on then. So as part of the Act, there was a requirement to set out carbon budgets, which is really what the sector emission ceilings are all about. So the Climate Change Advisory Committee Council, which is chaired by Mary Donnelly, set out 3 carbon budgets from 2021 to 2025, 2025 to 2030, and 2030 to 2035. They set out the overall level of carbon that could be emitted across the economy, and obviously outlining how that figure is going to be 51% lower by 2030 relative to 2018. So the first 2 carbon budgets, we need to come down by 51%. Next slide, please. So those budgets were set out. So what happened then was last November, we got the ranges. So the range was set out for agriculture at between 22 or 21.7 and 30%. And there was ranges set out for the other sectors as well. So so what happened then is following the ranges, the job of the government was that they needed to set specific sector emissions ceilings for each of these subsectors. And that's what happened over what was announced last week. So, and that what we see here now are the final sector emission ceilings. So electricity has to reduce by 75% by 2030, transport by 50%, buildings by 44%, which will be challenging enough given the fact that we're going to be adding building stock over the coming years. So 44 is probably lower than what is lower than it actually looks. Industry 35%, agriculture 25%. So while we rightly feel 25% is high, and it is high, it is a high bar for us to try and jump, we still have the lowest by a distance from many of the other sectors. Now, as I say, it was 22 to 30, and obviously we would love to see it be at the very bottom of the range. In reality, you know, if it was at the very bottom of the range, as President has said at the start of his open address, there was a serious political aspect to this. If it was at the very end of the lower end of the range, you know, it's hard to see how you possibly would have seen, you know, a coalition collapse. Where it ended up, you know, is 3 percentage points above that. And obviously we'd like to see it as low as possible, but I think that it genuinely, but for the intervention of the IFA and its grassroots members, I think that figure would be genuinely significantly higher. So when you add all those up, you might have seen in the media, it comes to about 43%. It doesn't hit the 51%. So what they did then was that they have another sector called unallocated savings, where there's 5.25 million tonnes of a reduction put into that box, and the black box, you could call it. And that is basically to be allocated on a whole of economy basis during the second carbon budget, so during 25 to 30, based on new technologies which are not yet identified. And the other thing you'll see there is that, and Carol covered it earlier, what you have there is LULUCF, so it's land use change and forestry, and I'm going to cover that in a minute now. And there's no target set out for that. That has been deferred for 18 months until the land use analysis study is completed. And I saw in the national press over the weekend that there was a senior source was quoted as referring to LULUCF as the sleeping giant of climate targets. And maybe you might move on to the next slide, and this might give a context of why this is such a potential problem. So LULUCF covers emissions and removals from land, direct land, including commercial uses and forestry. So in other words, it covers emissions that come out of the soil, carbon that is sequestered in the soil, and as well then as forestry and what happens from a forestry perspective. So it's different from when you put fertilizer or slurry out on soil. The emissions that come from that are in agriculture, because that's directly related to agriculture. This is what's happening within the soil, I suppose, underneath the surface. Now, at the moment, based on international, the international AR5, or the assessment report 5 from the IPCC. So basically the current rules we have to work on. Per the EPA, the LULUCF is emitting almost 8 million tonnes per annum. And that's mainly from grassland and wetlands. So the grassland and wetlands are down to be emitting 9.5 million tonnes at the moment. And that's predominantly due to emissions from peat soil, from drained peat soil. Now, one of the things to remember on this is, and Carl mentioned earlier about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So basically, when you don't have national data, you default to tier 1, which is international value. So at the moment, when we measure emissions from peat soils or sequestration that's taking place, we're using international tier 1 analysis, because we don't have tier 2 figures at the moment. And there would be research, though it's single site, so it's very early days, that would indicate that we are probably significantly overestimating emissions from peat soils, and we may be underestimating soil carbon sequestration that occurs within soils. But until we have that done, across multiple sites and peer reviewed, we can't get that on the scorecard, so to speak, or into the emissions in a different way. And that's why the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory is so important. That effectively is Teagasc's project, where they're putting up flux towers and carrying out substantial soil sampling, particularly deep soil sampling, to figure out exactly what's going on within our soils, country specific. And then they can use those emissions factors. They can then get them peer reviewed and allow and then allow us to use better data that's specific to our country when it comes to these to LULUCF. The other issue we have with LULUCF is today forestry is a carbon sink of about 2 million tonnes. But that is declining, and it's going to continue to decline. And the reason it's going to continue to decline is because of the lack of planting that has taken place over the last number of years. So as we move on and our forestry matures, it slows down taking in carbon, because it takes in the bulk of its carbon in the early phase of growth, early to mid phase growth. We don't have a massive stock of forestry in that phase, because of the lack of plankton that has gone on in the last few years. So the other issue we have with LULUCF is that we have potentially forestry becoming less of a sink than it already is. So I suppose that's just the context of LULUCF. It's not straightforward. Now the data at the moment on it, I think everybody would agree is less than ideal. As we move through the decade, I think we're going to get better data, more accurate assessment of what level of peat size we have. Some of it might have naturally re-wetted, and then that will adjust it. Because by 2030, agriculture is going to be likely to be put together with LULUCF, but we would believe at that stage there'll be a very, very different picture of what LULUCF is doing in terms of sequestration and emissions from peatlands when we have much better data at a national level. Next slide, please. Now, just moving on. So if we look at the agriculture sector and we say, okay, because I suppose in fairness, what farmers have been asking over the last few days is, well, what does this mean? What's going to happen on my farm because of these targets? So the first thing we look at is, if we look at the climate action plan that was set out last November by the government. So this is what the government set out as their plans to reduce emissions in the agriculture sector. So it's their plan now, and their take on the targets from and the measures proposed. So the first one was improve nutrient management. That's all about reducing the amount of fertilizer, increasing the amount of low emission slurry spreading, and increasing the use of protected urea. And that can deliver probably a real, all lights green 2 million tons. So the and the interesting thing about that is that you will hear a lot about re-wetting of peat soils being mentioned by as an option. If you take a mineral soil, if you drain a mineral soil, you actually reduce emissions for agriculture, because what it means is that you'll have less emissions when fertilizer is applied to drain mineral soils, and you also have, if stock are on it and they're producing dung or urine on it, the emissions from it when it's drained is less. So draining mineral soils would actually contribute significantly from a positive sense in terms of reducing our emissions. The other things are improving animal breeding. That's working with the ICBF to identify lower methane livestock and breeding off them. And in fairness, the ICBF are doing a lot of work on that at the moment. Looking at the animal feeding side of it, that's all about reducing the crude protein levels being fed for meal, particularly at grass, and also looking at the use of additives. Now, the use of feed additives inside in that 0.7 figure isn't massive. There's a small amount factored in. Earlier finishing of cattle, which it's basically reduced the age of slaughter cattle by 3 months over the decade. So it's not necessarily bringing a 27, it says average slaughter 27 to 24 months. That's not saying that to bring a 27-month-old animal to 24 months. It's saying bring the average age, because obviously you have heifers, young bulls, all that side of it. And there would be still a substantial amount of cattle being killed at significantly older than 27 months. So and actually the trend over the last decade has been that we've taken about 3 months off the average age over the last decade. So if we just continue at the same trend, we actually would achieve that figure. The other thing is increase organic farming, which would give a 0.3 of a reduction. And that's only through reducing intensity. So it's not through like organic farming helping reduce emissions. It's because you'll have less, you won't be able to use fertilizer if you're organic, and you probably may have to bring back your stocking rate. So it's factoring in that lower intensity. And then the last one then is injecting biodiesel into the national grid, anaerobic digestion effectively, which is only 0.1 or 0.2 because it goes to energy. That there is just relating to reducing intensity. Again, you decide to grow grass and put it into an anaerobic digester instead of putting it into a bovine rumen or a sheep rumen. And there's also a bit as well in that you might reduce the amount of methane from slurry because of the fact that it's going into an anaerobic digester. So you add that all up, it comes to 16 to 18%. So what's not in that then is you don't have the potential for, a substantial use of a feed additive, which in fairness, the research on that is promising, and a confinement system. So when the cattle are indoors 365 days a year, getting a TMR diet, the research is showing it works. What's not showing at the moment is it's working for a grass-based system. But the research is ongoing, and I genuinely think that, you know, we've got a few years yet that the technology will deliver something in the form of a bolus or something like that that will work for a feed additive. The other thing that will happen is that we'll have a rebasing of methane emissions from bovines, which Carol mentioned earlier, and the research on that Teagasc are taking place is very promising. But it is worth remembering that it may well be that the 2018 figure will be rebased. So in other words, where we are at the 2018, because of the fact that the methane might never have been there, but it will help reduce the overall level of emissions we have, and it will help to some extent reduce in terms of contribute somewhat to the target as well. And the other thing there is there possibly could be something in slurry additives as well, which we're not sure yet. Again, from a technology perspective, something could deliver on that. It's early stages. The research has shown that it works in certain cases, but it does depend on you know, the type, and then as well as would the slatted tanks be able to be fit for purpose in terms of if the slurry was acidified. So the point here is that these show 16 to 18%. Then you add on those few there, you could see a pathway to 22% with a bit of a fair wind behind you. What, you know, you move on 3 percentage points more. It's I can't see it, you know, in terms of when I look at the analysis that's there to us. And we need it's up to the government now to put that plan in front of us to say, well, if you're saying 25% of the figure, show us the amended climate action plan that delivers that figure, and also show us the funding that you're going to put behind it to deliver it. Because it's one thing to give a target, but if you're not going to put funding behind it, and I think that's probably what frustrated farmers most in some of the commentary, particularly around anaerobic digester and solar. I mean, like it's like they discovered it 3 weeks ago. Well, if there was a proper policy framework and funding put behind it 10 years ago, we would have a completely different picture in terms of renewable energy today. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for farmers? So basically, if you look at the climate action plan and say, well, what does this mean on my farm? So it's likely we're going to see reduction in the levels of fertilizer use that you'll be permitted to use, and it will be a change in the type of fertilizer. So CAN will be phased out progressively. Whether it'll be fully phased out or not, I'm not sure, but protected urea, if and when the industry can deliver it, they'll need to be switched to protected urea. We'll see increased use of low emission slurry spreading progressively through the decade, and to get to a level where the vast majority of slurry is applied through some form of less. And we acknowledge now there may be some farms that mightn't work for due to soil, topography or whatever, but for the vast bulk of the cases, it's likely that that's going to be the system that will be used. We're likely to see the government looking at trying to ensure earlier slaughter of animals. That trend continues. There will be an encouragement for uptake of organic farming. We've seen that already in the current the national strategic, the CAP strategic plan has put significant additional funding towards organic farming, and research focus on lower methane livestock, feed additives, and that side of it. So they're the high level figures, things that we're going to see, we're going to see measures come around based on what the climate action plan that was outlined last year. And the food vision groups do give an insight into the likely future direction, and I have a couple of slides on them now which I'll touch on. But I suppose, as I've said, just to repeat myself, Bob, but we don't know yet what the next plan is going to entail, but what it needs to show is a pathway to 25%. They've said it's going to be voluntary, so right, that's fine. Let's show us the voluntary way you're going to do it. That's what you said you're going to do, and also show us the money. What's the funding package going to be? That's going to be in tandem with the required measures. Next slide, please. So just before before we I finish up, like in terms of, I might touch briefly on the food vision groups, because I think they do give an insight into what government thinking is in terms of measures that are likely to come down the tracks. So the minister established 2 food vision groups, a food vision dairy group and a food vision beef and sheep group. The dairy group was established I think around February, March. The beef group had its first meeting in June. So there's about, the dairy group is about 3 months ahead in terms of, because they're both following a similar path of, in terms of producing an interim report, both then producing a final report, hopefully by the end of the year is what their plan is. So, and the membership of the group is farm organisations, industry, state agencies, and key department officials. And so the first thing is the dairy group has issued an interim report which produced 17 recommendations. The beef group has only met in June 22, so hasn't progressed to interim report stage as of yet. Dairy group being chaired by Professor Jerry Broyle, beef group being chaired by Professor Thea Hennessy from UCC. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just focus on 3 recommendations that came out of the dairy group, because I think it gives context maybe to what is being talked about. So the first one is consider a voluntary, and actually that's a typo, that should be reduction or exit scheme. So it's this was for looking at from a dairy group, so it was looking at dairy cows. So it was looking at bringing in a voluntary reduction scheme for farmers that would allow them to voluntarily decide to either reduce numbers or exit altogether. So so I suppose we had, you know, a lot of concerns around this from an IFA perspective, particularly around potential impacts on land mobility, and that's an impact on the family farm model. And I suppose I don't necessarily want to get into the nuts and bolts of this tonight now, but because I suppose more just to try and give you the thinking that's there. So that what we said was that we said on the basis that we were going to have detailed stakeholder engagement, we supported the recommendation for further consideration of the scheme. But I suppose the other thing to note is that a recent working paper prepared by the group placed an estimated economic cost of €4,300 on a dairy cow. So that's the first one of the 3 key recommendations that came out of the dairy group. Next slide, please. So the second one was about exploring the potential of a methane-focused cap and trade emissions model. But the IFA have very significant concerns about this. It was something we did not support, even to have a study completed on it, because we effectively see it as a quota by another name. And the other thing about it is that the cap and trade model, you know, where even if you brought it in for dairy only, it could have significant implications for other ruminant sectors if it was expanded out to other ruminant sectors as well, because in what happens then with the potential interaction between beef and dairy in terms of a cap and trade methodology. And I suppose also, which we thought was another major flaw in it, it didn't take account of carbon removals. So even though the sequestration, as I say, is in a different pot at the moment, it's in LULUCF, not to say at a national level you can't start measuring carbon sequestration for farmers and telling them how much carbon they're sequestering. And then you could have it in a national model. So on the basis of these concerns, we did not support this, and we were the only stakeholder in the food vision group that rejected that measure. And finally, next slide, please. So finally, the slide 4, or recommendation 4, which was around the use of artificial fertilizers, so in the dairy sector. And the objective is they're seeking to reduce fertilizer usage by 30% by 2030, with a short-term reduction of 22% by 2025. So I suppose when our position was that we recognise that we do need to reduce the level of inorganic nitrogen used by the dairy sector, but we couldn't support the 30% reduction because there was no study to say, impact study or economic impact analysis to say, first of all, from a research perspective, that it was feasible, and second of all, that you couldn't achieve it without having massive damage to profitability and productivity of dairy farms. And we referenced the Chagas analysis, which showed that a 20% reduction in inorganic nitrogen reduced dairy incomes by 10%. So again, showed a potentially very, very significant impact that's in the absence of establishment of clover. So when we were looking at it, we felt that 20% reduction was probably something that could be aimed for over a 10-year period. given the fact that, first of all, from a food vision perspective, the agriculture more or less signed up to that figure anyway. And we did feel that, you know, with use of clover, better use of slurry, more strategic use of slurry, that level was achievable over the decade. And in fairness, we probably could well be back 10 to 15% this year, given the trend in fertilizer use this year. So I suppose we didn't accept this proposal. It's a proposal as it is, but I suppose what it does do is it gives you an insight into where we are, or some of the measures that potentially could be coming down the track. So final slide. Thanks, Ethan. So just, I suppose, in terms of next steps and upcoming policy challenges, because there is more coming at us. So the first thing we have is we're going to get the updated climate action plan. I would expect before the end of the year, or well before the end of the year. That's going to give us the roadmap, and we expect associated funding requirements as well should be a part of that. So we're also going to have the recommendations of the food vision groups. You've seen some of the recommendations already. We'll have a beef and sheep group with recommendations as well coming before the end of the year. We also have the nitrates action plan, and what we have is we have Antashka seeking leave to take a judicial review on the climate nitrates action plan, and we have sought to be a notice party on that because we want to make sure that we can represent our members appropriately. If there is a legal challenge, that we can put our case forward on behalf of our members, and it also gives us other options in terms of making sure we can properly represent the industry or farming members against any judicial challenge that's being brought. There's also an increasing focus on the derogation and the associated regulations, and you know what we see now is the 250 organic N figure coming under increasing pressure. The Department of Agriculture acquiesced to a midterm review with a potential reduction of 22 from 250 to 230 or 220 with the European Commission without any consultation with the IFA, and that is now something that we have to try and make sure that we can make sure that anything we're doing here is appropriate, and we don't have knee-jerk reactions when we already are taking significant steps in terms of making sure that the trend in water quality, which has shown a downward trend over recent years, is addressed. And a lot of the measures have taken place, but if we don't allow time for them to take action, well, then it's going to be difficult to see any positive improvement if we don't give any lag period allowance. We have the Biodiversity Citizens Assembly coming into being. We have an industrial emissions directive coming from the EU, which will be coming the latter half of this decade, which could potentially see environmental licensing requirements for any farmer with 150 livestock units. We also have an EU carbon farming initiative coming before the end of the year, and we also have a national land use strategy underway. So, well, I suppose what is like there is a whole pile on the runway here, and it is really, you know, I think farmers, you know, rightly feel that they're probably under attack to a certain extent. But look, from our perspective, we will make sure that we are defending our members and putting forward reasoned and balanced argument, and to ensure that, you know, we sustain what is a really, you know, it's a vital industry for rural Ireland. And I suppose I don't want to finish on a very negative note with all these here, because I suppose I just want to put context on it, because but it's like the point here is that there is a lot of different policies interacting here, and what we've got to make sure is that we stay on top of them as best we can, and that we represent our farmers' interests, and that we ensure that anything that's put in place is balanced and is also properly compensated for if it is something that's going to hit our farmers' financial well-being. So I might hand it back to you there, President, and maybe we might, before we take questions, maybe Paul or Ryan might want to make a contribution. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. I'll take questions later.
Thanks, Tig, and thanks, Carol. I think, Joe, that's been an excellent walkthrough, where we came from, I suppose more importantly, where we are now. I know, Paul, you'd like to just make a comment there as well, because Paul and the Environmental Committee, our own Environmental Committee, had been doing quite a lot of work on this as well. I'll hand it over to you, Paul, there before we open it up.
Okay, thanks, President, and I hope you can all hear me clear. I suppose, look, just to maybe go 1 or 2 steps, and look, well done to Carol and Tig for the work that they put in. Back a couple of months ago at our last full committee meeting, we decided to give this a shot. Obviously, our farmers, our members are expecting us to give it a good go, to make sure that we at least ask the question. And if I'm being honest with you, in the lead up to that, a lot of people, a lot of politicians, a lot of the civil service were saying every single one of these targets will be at the very, very maximum. They're going to be 30% for agriculture. We didn't take that, and we said we'll give it a go. And I suppose, in fairness to my own environmental committee, to a lot of National Council, and many, many people who are on the call here tonight, we did ask the questions. We put doubt in politicians' minds in order to say, is this a safe journey for us to be bringing Irish agriculture on? And the reality is 22%, we said, would put our shoulder to the wheel, and we would work with government and with all of the state bodies in order to deliver a 22% reduction. But the 25, Tig and Carol and the President are correct. There is no plan. This won't come with an IFA logo on top. This will come with a heart. This is the Irish government now telling us that we have to do more. But at the moment, unfortunately, there is no plan. Congratulations to the guys tonight for coming up with so much information. But really, the information that we need as farmers going forward is to see what this is going to look like and how it's going to impact on our farming businesses going forward. We have to be honest about this. 25 is going to be serious for farming. It is going to be a major challenge for us, as well as other parts of society. Transport at 50%. We're going to be a part of that transition. Energy at 75%. We will have to be a part of that transition as well. We are, as farmers, we are a part of this whole process. But we're probably affected more than most other segments of society. The reality is that we will have to be encouraged to retrofit our houses, buy the electric vehicles, put heat pumps in instead of burning kerosene or burning peat. We'll have to do that as well. And that's going to come at a massive cost to farming and everybody. Look, I suppose, where do we go forward now? We need policy, and we need to be able to, to direct us from members through the environmental committee's membership. Every county executive has an input into that, to direct policy going forward. And where will that bring us to? But ultimately, this is always going to end up in negotiations. Massive amounts of money will have to be thrown at the likes of Choggers to make sure that the work that they are doing will provide the information that we will need. Let's be honest, we could have done with the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory or the signposts. They should have been started probably 4 or 5 years ago. But we are where we are. We're 1.5 years into this study. We're only really getting baseline figures from now on. We'll need to continue those studies over the next number of years to really tell us exactly where we are as farmers and what our soils are actually doing. So this meeting's about the members tonight, President. I don't want to take it completely over, but I can let members be reassured. The effort that we put in over the last 6 weeks and 2 months in order to get the target down from 30% down to 25 will be that workload will be included. We'll continue with the vigour that we've shown, when once again IFA have proven beyond any doubt that when the IFA is together and when we work collectively together, we can produce results. So 25 is disappointing. I would agree with everybody. It could have been 30, and what that would have looked like is probably over 450,000 animals leaving farms over the next 6-7 years. So they stay on farms and their progeny stays on farms as well. But we need to be very, very clear, and the President has said this as well. This any reduction in stock will be voluntary. There will be no compulsory. We will make sure that the minister is true to his word when he says this will be a voluntary process. The farmers, if they wish to engage in this process, can do. There will be no compulsory nature in any stock reduction.